Scientists, what incident will traumatize you for the rest of your life? I research human sleep, but my recent discovery has kept me awake for 5 days straight, too terrified to risk closing my eyes. You'd think a sleep scientist would know that you need your sleep to survive, but I've never been more horrified. I work in a sleep laboratory at a university. Our most recent research project has been into lucid dreaming and finding ways to read and create dreams. We would be working with some of the best sleep researchers in the world, so I was extremely excited to be working on this project. I expected we would make some great new findings. However, no one could have ever guessed the horrific discoveries we were about to make. I wish we never did the experiment in the first place. Our current understanding of lucid dreaming is that it occurs during REM, a period of sleep where your eyes move around rapidly while still being closed. But the most interesting thing about it is that your brain waves are almost identical to your waking brain waves. Usually you'll be unaware you're dreaming, but people that are aware can use this knowledge to control what happens during the lucid dream. So to learn more, we set up an experiment using 7 self-declared lucid dreamers from the student community. Of the 7, 4 of them turned out to be lying about their lucid dreaming abilities, which we were able to check using brain scans. And even though 3 people wouldn't really be enough, we decided to run the experiment anyway. This was a big mistake. In our first test, we asked our lucid dreamers to imagine they are in a room while they are dreaming. Since lucid dreamers are able to control their dreams, we asked them to simply pour themselves a cup of tea and drink it in the dream. They were hooked up to electrodes that monitor bodily functions and brainwaves, and filmed with an unobtrusive night vision camera. Our first and second nights both went very well. Patient A and B completed the necessary steps and apparently imagined themselves flying afterwards. Patient B apparently began the dream by making love with Rita Hayworth, but afterwards completed the correct steps. It wasn't until the 3rd night that we started to have trouble. Our patients all sleep in a long dormitory with each bed fenced off, so they have their own little capsule. Patient C, our most efficient lucid dreamer, woke up midway through an REM cycle. Woke up is quite a gentle term for what happened. Her whole torso jerked up from the bed as if she'd been stabbed in the back, and she brought herself round with a strangled scream. Then she sat up in the bed and started to sob. I was running the lab that night, and I went running down to her capsule. I was concerned about her well-being, yes, but I also didn't want her to wake up the other 2 patients. I helped her out of the bed and led her up to the control room. "He wouldn't leave," she kept moaning. It's okay," I kept muttering in response. Patient C shuddered deeply. In the room, the tea room, there was a man. I saw him sitting there, but he wouldn't leave. I'm not a lucid dreamer, so I didn't understand exactly how it worked. I said, "I guess anything can seem threatening when you're in a nightmare." Patient C, tear-blotched as she was, looked up at me with astonishing sharpness. "I don't have nightmares," she said, slowly and deliberately. "I can control my dreams. That's why you picked me. Except he wouldn't leave." She paused, closed her eyes, swallowed, then said much more quietly, "And he looked at me, and his eyes, they were just, he looked at me and I could feel he wanted me to effing die." At this point, the monitors for patient A started flashing. Patient A was spasming in his bed. I went running back down to the dormitory, but by the time I got to patient A, his screams had already woken up patient B, who was opening the panel of her capsule and sleepily asking what was going on. I pulled the panels back on their grooves, grabbed patient A and shook him hard. I shouldn't have done that, it was unprofessional, but I was unnerved. Patient A, as he came to terrible consciousness, was screaming, "You're not there! You're not there! You can't hurt me! You can't hurt me!" He was screaming it like someone who was in nerve-shredding agony. After settling them all down, it turned out patient A had had the same dream as patient C, except that after the unknown man had refused to leave, patient A had poured him a cup of tea and started cracking some jokes. He said it would happen sometimes where his dreams weren't 100% controllable, but he would go along with it. He said that the man's face had concentrated into an expression of poisonous hatred, and he had started to feel uncomfortable. Not scared, but actual physical discomfort, as if he'd run a marathon and was fighting for breath. However, the faint discomfort quickly became agonizing as he started to struggle breathing. He said the man in the dream started bleeding from everywhere, watching a woundless bloodbath and starting to suffocate when I shook him awake. A and C both gave us descriptions of the man, and they matched. About 21 years old, cheeks marred with rosacea, limp, greasy hair, bloodshot eyes, a crooked front tooth, pouchy belly visible beneath stained t-shirt, face exhausted and full of hatred. We should have ended the experiment here. Something was clearly wrong, but I'm sorry to say that the primary reaction of the lab was buzzing excitement. It seemed we'd managed to create a shared figure, perhaps dredged from the primal depths of the human unconsciousness, using our skeleton dream narrative. So night 4 began. I wasn't allowed to work on this night since we were required as sleep scientists to have proper sleep. But something was different about my sleep that night at home. I went to bed. I dreamed. I dreamed about shopping for rainbow paint at a hardware store. It was the latest thing on Instagram. I hated it, but my girlfriend was insistent we paint my apartment with it. In my dream, I wandered up to a store employee with an IG picture on my phone. Excuse me," I mumbled, "but I'm trying to find that paint that comes out of the tin as a rainbow. Pastel, preferably, sorry." The employee turned around and fixed me with an expression of the deepest, purest hatred. Sallow skin with blossoming circles of red, wretched, pouchy eyes, a snarl that revealed a single crooked tooth. I turned and ran. You know what that means in a dream? I turned and I started to move excruciatingly slowly through what felt like treacle. Behind me, a noise that sounded like a short, barked laugh with no humor and with so much disgust I could feel my skin pimpling under its pressure. The man walked around me and stood in front of me. That's what I'll always remember. Everything else was obeying dream logic, such as myself running extremely slowly. But the man in my dream moved with the simple briskness of a real person. Blood was bubbling up from his lower eyelid. There was blood coming out of his ears, blood dripping off his fingers from a source under his sleeves. I was still trying to run, though by now it was taking me towards him. I was aware of a horrible pain in my throat, far too intense to be dreamt. It felt as if I was being strangled. I was starting to lose consciousness. In my dream, I was starting to die. I woke up sharply with a howl because my cat had bitten me on the face. He leapt off me as soon as my eyes opened and sat on the floor beside the bed, haunches raised, hair on end, making a low, rasping growl. I touched my cheek. I was bleeding where he'd bitten me. My cat is a big softy. Not only has he never bitten or scratched me, but he's never bitten or scratched anyone, not even my ex, who had hated him and who often used to shove him off chairs and tabletops with rather more force than was strictly required. But he'd bitten me awake. He'd known something was wrong, and thank God he woke me up. I stumbled into the bathroom to try and clear up the mess. I was badly rattled, so once I'd stuck a plaster over it, I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of non-caffeinated tea. I went back to my bedroom and tried to soothe my freaked-out cat. So it was a little while before I thought to check my phone. 5:16 a.m. One message from the sleep lab: patient A was dead. We shut the experiment down after that. Patient A recorded as in excellent health. Captain of the university track team, a young, vibrant, clean-living man had died of a heart attack in his sleep. Acting under orders from my supervisor, I interviewed both B and C about what had happened in their dreams. B's was harrowing. She saw a man with a crooked tooth and exhausted eyes. The same man as before. I didn't like to ask much more than that. I knew it wasn't just a nightmare. I knew how real he felt. C hadn't entered the room. C tended to start her dreams outdoors, but she said as she walked, she said she could feel faces, or rather the same face, peering through the windows at her, locked in its grimace of pure hatred. She never looked at it directly. She kept walking, even as the streets narrowed and the buildings became more decrepit. She walked until she found the road ended in an alleyway with a single squat building at the end, a door ajar. She turned and tried to leave, but no matter which direction she turned, she was at the end of an alley, and the only way forward's through the door. Fortunately, a strange word to use in the circumstances, the furore around A's sudden death woke her up. I emailed my write-up of the reports to my supervisor, and he emailed back almost immediately asking to see me. I'd assumed it would be about insurance paperwork following the death of a patient in the lab, but it wasn't. It was funding paperwork. I was rattled, in pain and tired. I snapped at him. "You can't seriously be thinking of applying for funding for another year? After this?" He sighed deeply. "A man has died. And without this funding," he replied, "the department will die. My job, your job, the postdocs, the junior professors, the TAs, the students, all of them." So I was a bit too flustered to say anything and looked down at the paperwork again. One of the pieces of paper was headed the John Riney Foundation and had a little picture of the man I presumed was John Riney. It must have been an official photo taken for an undergraduate student card. He was beaming against a professional photographer's blue background wearing a plain green sweater. Even upside down, I could see that he had a crooked front tooth. In that young, happy, open face, it looked rather charming. I felt a wave of nausea rise up through me and had to steady myself on the edge of the desk. My supervisor saw the stagger and followed the line of my gaze. "Oh yes, the donator for the department. Poor John. I was a postdoc when he died. Not an experiment I was working on, thankfully. It reminds me a bit of this situation." I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I was remembering the John Riney of my dreams with his exhausted, insomniac's eyes. He came here to have his insomnia cured. "What?" My supervisor looked rather startled. "Oh, I suppose this was a long time before." "No. John Riney was a perfectly healthy lad. He was part of an early experiment on lucid dreaming, back when we were trying to work out how to measure lucid dreaming at all. Anyway, the process wound up giving him severe insomnia, and you know as well as I do what lack of sleep can do to a person. This was like nothing we'd ever seen. He'd go without sleep for weeks at a time. Awful stuff. He killed himself in the end." "Killed himself," I repeated weakly. "Yes," said my supervisor solemnly. "A terrible shame. His parents set up the foundation, which gives us the endowment. It's nice in a way. Actually, when you think about it, he lives on through our dreams." I left the office without saying anything. We broke up for Christmas. I haven't slept properly for nearly 5 days because I don't want to sleep deeply enough to get to REM sleep. Dream sleep always comes after deep sleep. But I can feel my eyelids drooping even as I type. If I fall asleep, it might be my last ever dream.